Tomorrow night, I plan to tell you about an unusual experience I had while flying my own plane. I was hijacked by the devil. But tonight, because quite a few have asked me to do so, I thought we could spend this evening touring Russia, the Soviet Union. I had the privilege of spending 2 weeks. And the longer I stayed in that country, the more thankful I was that I live in a country where I have and can enjoy freedom. The preparations for our trip through Russia started about 4 years before we actually went into the country. I use the term Russia because that is the one that we commonly use. However, when you get to Russia, don't use the word. It is not Russia. Russia passed off the map in 1917, 1918. When you're in Russia, you talk about the Soviet Union. So let's forget Russia and make plans to go through the Soviet Union. The pastor of our largest church in the Soviet Union is Pastor Alex Parasay. His wife is the main translator who translates any material from English into the Russian language. She has been working at that for about 11 or 12 years. That is her full-time job. Nadia is her name, her first name. Nadia Parasay is an unusual lady with some very unusual ideas. She speaks English fluently and has been translating many of the Spirit of Prophecy books which have to be smuggled into the country for her to translate. She had arranged with friends in the States to try and get her certain books which she had not yet been able to get in. These friends of hers had tried on 3 different occasions. They had mailed these books, which never arrived. On other occasions, they tried to send them in. They were confiscated at the border. So these 4 books, which she wanted so badly to translate into the Russian language and also into the Ukrainian language, just seemed to be blocked. She could not get them. Then our mutual friend in the States decided to try using us, who were working in a socialistic country, the country of Tanzania, and use us perhaps with a final attempt to getting these books into the Soviet Union. So the books were sent to us. My wife wrapped them very carefully and with many Tanzanian stamps around there, all over the parcel, many more than normally you would put on. We mailed them to the Soviet Union, and within about 2 months we got a reply from Nadia herself. She had received the books and was very grateful that she had them. From then on, we were sending books in at least twice a year, and my wife and Mrs. Parasay became very good friends by correspondence. Then when we went to the Vienna General Conference, we met Pastor Parasay, who was one of the delegates to the General Conference in Vienna. When we met him, he just seemed to treat us as long-lost friends. He said, "For 4 years now, I have known you, but this is the first time I've had to visit you." Before we got to Europe, in fact, we had made arrangements of application forms filled out, requesting a visa for the Soviet Union. In discussing some of the details with Pastor Parasay, he gave us a few suggestions of what we might do. But as we applied for these visas to go through the Soviet Union, you also had to submit a detailed itinerary of what you wanted to visit, where you wanted to go, how long you planned to stay, and all the details. On your travel for the day, we were planning on driving through. Many people fly into Moscow, fly into Leningrad or one of those cities and see the country that way. But some friends of ours in Germany made it possible for us to have a nice car, and all we had to do is to put in the fuel. So we decided to drive through. Our detailed plans were very carefully outlined. It was only 2 weeks after the General Conference that we finally got the reply, and the request was granted. The man at the Soviet embassy through whom we had to work in Vienna told us that about 20%, just under 25% of those who applied received their visa. That's the general statistics. But he said for those driving through, it's a much lower percent. If you just wanted to fly in, you'd have at least a 25% chance, perhaps, of having a favorable reply to your request. So it was with grateful hearts that we started out on our journey, going through, approaching the Soviet Union from the north, through Finland. From Helsinki, it's only about a 3-hour drive down to the border. It happened to be on my wife's birthday that we got to the border. She jokingly said, well, I hope these guards, these Russian guards, will know it's my birthday if they check my passport as closely as we were told that they would. Maybe they'll be kind enough to let us through without too much delay. We were at that border for just over 3 hours. And not because there was such a rush of tourists trying to flood into the Soviet Union. Not at all. On the contrary, there were very few cars. But about 10 minutes over 3 hours that we waited there, those Russian guards, those customs officials, those immigration men, the customs men especially, went through everything. We took everything out of the car. They lifted up every seat. They just about pulled the upholstery off to check and to see what we had in that car. They made us drive over a pit. 2 mechanics, they called them. They said they were mechanics. They're checking to see if the car was really, really roadworthy, safe to drive through the Soviet Union. Checked underneath very, very carefully. As they went through my suitcase, they came to my Bible. I had been told that there might be problems there. I had to spend, finally, through the lower grade of the customs officers, 45 minutes, and then finally I requested permission, the privilege of seeing the head customs official at that border, with a little Russian girl of about 16 who could speak broken English, who was the only one at that border who could speak English. Finally, I was able to persuade the chief of the customs that I was a minister, that this Bible was mine by the use of it, by the marking, by the age on it. He could see that it had been well used. But, he said, here is a little note. You take this note at your exit point down in the south. If you do not present this note, and you do not present your Bible, you could be detained indefinitely by the Soviet Union officials. Well, I didn't need all of that warning, of course. But it was a real battle. One of the 3 hours that we were held up there was to try and clear my Bible through that border. And I was told subsequently that it was the guidance of the Lord that got me through there with the Bible. I didn't realize it would be quite that rough. Because of the delay at the border, much longer than we had anticipated in our itinerary and our planned time for driving from point A to B, we had to drive 2 hours after dark. Now, we had been warned, get to your destination before dark. They do not like any vehicles on the road after dark. And if the vehicles have to be on the road after dark, you must not drive with your bright lights, only your parking lights. Well, that night before we came to the guest entertainment quarters, whatever you want to call them, we had to drive for nearly 2 hours, very slowly, over very bad roads with only the parking lights. The accommodations, as I say, were very austere. And one thing I might just mention as added interest, At that place and at every place we slept for 15 nights in some of the, what they considered in Moscow, some of the most elaborate of hotels. There was a continual reminder of inefficient, antiquated sewage systems. In a country so highly developed in technology, it amazed us to think that that continual stench would be present. At the little hotel where we spent the night, it was almost overpowering. It was difficult. We went into a little dormitory, a room of 8 beds, where the family was allowed to sleep because there were not too many tourists. By tourists, I mean most of the tourists in the Soviet Union are citizens of that nation, coming from different points of that large country. Very few that come in and drive through the country from outside of the nation. So, because the tourist trade was pretty low, we were allowed that whole section of the hotel, a large dormitory room with 8 beds. We were allowed to have that as a family without having to bunk with any others. The next day we drove on through Leningrad, spent some time in Leningrad. The main thing that impressed us in Leningrad was the show of buildings, impressive buildings, beautiful buildings, but only of veneer, most of them. Some of them were genuine all the way through, but in talking to the guide, I almost had to bribe one of them, and I'll tell you a little later on what currency we used for bribing. But I finally got permission to drive down a little alley behind one of these huge 34 or 35 story buildings. But down this little passage, down this little alley, you could really see what an old wreck of a building it was. Window panes, nearly every one of them broken, as far up as you could see. But in front, a beautiful facade, veneer. Then we got to Moscow. Spent nearly 3 days in Moscow. It was in Moscow that I discovered the value of chewing gum. It sounds ridiculous. The guide that was given to us, a young man that could speak English very well, the first day he was going to show us around various points of interest in Moscow. He came to one of their famous museums. Personally, I'm not overly thrilled with the idea of going through museums, but he was the one that outlined the interest points and the points that were considered historically very valuable in Moscow. So to the museum was where we headed, the first item on the agenda of that day. The young guide, as we got there, he said, "My, there are more people here than I anticipated." He estimated 2,000 lined up there waiting to get into this museum. I looked at it, I would have said more than 2,000. There must have been 8 lines. I counted 6 or 7, and I think there were 2 others behind, he told me later on. Long lines. Fortunately, the whole parking lot was taken up with people, not with cars, because there are not too many cars in the country. So the place that he said we could park in was, I think there were 3 other cars, 4 altogether, but filled up with these thousands of tourists waiting to get in. As we drove into the parking lot and stopped, I said to the guide, "But is it really that interesting? You think we can get in? We'll have to wait here perhaps 2 or 3 hours to get in." "Well, sir," he said, noticing a packet of chewing gum that one of our boys had left on the dashboard of the car, he said, "Please, sir, could you give me just 1 piece of chewing gum? If you give me one little piece of the 5 pieces in a packet of Wrigley's chewing gum, if you give me 1 piece of chewing gum, I happen to know the director of the museum. I'll take this piece of chewing gum to the director, and he'll let you go in right in first, right in front." Chewing gum. To the director of one of the most famous museums in Moscow. "Surely," I said, "take the whole packet if that'll make us get in." The boys happened to have a little supply, a nice little supply of chewing gum, which came in very, very handy. But we only discovered it the first day we went through Moscow. Sure enough, with one stick of chewing gum, our guide went in there, and in about 2 minutes he was back with his face all beaming. Come on, we'll go right to the front. And we went right to the front with perhaps 2,000, 2,500 who had lined up there since crack of dawn to get in because of a little piece of chewing gum. As we pull up to a service station, young men, young women, not just kids, not just children, young men of 17, 18, 20, young ladies of the same age would see this car with a foreign license plate driving up to be serviced. And they'd literally come running, and the only English word they knew was chewing gum. They'd come running up to you with their hands full of little trinkets, little badges of Lenin with the Soviet Union flag, buckles, belt buckles, various other things, and they'd hold their hands full of these little trinkets, and they'd hand them out to you. And my second son is quite a businessman. His major is business administration, and he really made hay while the sun was shining. He got a whole bag full of interesting trinkets, including nice souvenirs, beautiful buckles, belt buckles. In fact, he got 5 or 6 of them. Finally, when our supply of chewing gum started running out, and we didn't think it would, but my oldest son was doing so much business that he ran out of chewing gum, or began to, then you know what he actually did, and it was accepted. He would break a piece of chewing gum into 4 pieces. And with a quarter of a piece of chewing gum, he continued his bartering. Well, Moscow was an interesting town, but really I have absolutely no desire to go back the second time. You have the feeling everywhere you go, in the camp, in the street, in the museum, down in Red Square, beside the Kremlin, wherever you go, you're being watched. And you just have that uneasy feeling. I asked my guide after we got to know him, I think it was the second or third day, are there people that are checking us? Well, you come from America, don't forget, he said. You have American passports. That was his only answer. Fortunately, we were driving a car that was using diesel, not petrol. Most of the cars, including the big lorries and the trucks in the Soviet Union, are petrol. Very few, very, very few diesels. You drive up to a service station, there'll be rows and rows of cars. We counted at one, 60, 62 cars waiting to be serviced, waiting to get their petrol. But with our diesel, there's usually one, and then at a large place where there would be, say, 30 or 40 pumps, all government controlled, of course, there would be maybe 2 diesel pumps. And you had your coupons, which you had bought at the beginning of your trip. No cash transaction, everything was coupons. All you do is ask for diesel. They give it a little different pronunciation, but they understand it when you say diesel, and they would immediately show you. Way off on one side would be the diesel pump. You'd drive up there, get filled up, and on your way. Whereas other people would have to wait several hours before they could get filled up with petrol. Our main objective was Kyiv. Kyiv is the 3rd largest city in the Soviet Union. Kyiv is the capital of the Ukraine. There's Moscow, number 1, Leningrad, number 2, and Kyiv, number 3. We were very anxious to meet Nadia Parasey. My wife especially was extremely anxious. We got to Kyiv right on schedule, Friday afternoon. While we were in Vienna, talking to Pastor Parasey, he held out a little hope that maybe he would be able to get permission from one of the government ministers who controlled religion as one of his side portfolios, a minor portfolio. he might be able to get permission, the Pastor Parase said, for me to give a little talk in the church on Sabbath. Well, I said, don't worry about that. It'll just be a privilege to worship with you, to be with you in your church. No, I'm going to try. There has been a new man that has taken over this government position. He seems to be much more friendly. I'm going to try, and maybe, just possibly, he'll give me permission to let you take the service. Well, Elder Karsich, who had been to the Soviet Union on a number of occasions, when he heard that we had applied for our visa at the General Conference, he said to me, he said, well, Leonard, he said, don't plan on giving any sermons there. In fact, I'd advise you definitely not to, because it's just not done. When we arrived at Kiev that Friday afternoon, I tried for 3 hours to find a telephone to call Pastor Parase, and was unsuccessful in doing so. That evening, after the evening meal, I still wanted to get in touch with the pastor, tell him we had arrived. Finally, just before they closed the gates at 10 o'clock and everybody must be in, we were able to find the telephone, and I contacted the pastor. Pastor Parase said to me, oh, Pastor Robinson, just yesterday morning I got written permission for you to take the service tomorrow morning in our church. What a privilege. The first Seventh-day Adventist minister outside of a national, a Russian, to be given permission to take the full 11 o'clock service. It was a real experience. That little shed, and that's all it was, that had been given to the Adventists to take on Sabbath, shared on Sunday by the Baptists, was a converted barn. Just a shed. The membership in our Kiev church is just on 700. It is the largest church that we have. I was happily surprised to find that they are allowed to attend church in the designated places where the government has given them a certain place. This old farm building, owned by the government, of course, had been very crudely adapted to be a church. There certainly were no more than 500, if I remember correctly, 520 seats, seating for about 520. But that day, there were over 700 present. I have had church services in the north, in more primitive countries, where little African boys and girls were crowding at the window, some standing and sitting in the passages, some sitting around up here in front. But I've never taken a service where the church was crowded as it was that day in Kiev. The windows, from standing outside, looking in, there were only 3 windows on this side and 3 windows on this side. Those windows, they actually got benches or drums, I saw by one window, where there were 3 layers of people right up to the top of the window, standing on drums. The church was, of course, I could never compare it to this beautiful building, but basically it had seating similar to what we have here, with the middle bank and the 2 side banks and the 2 passages down the middle. Those passages were packed, as tight as a person can stand with his hands at his side. Not only for the church service, for Sabbath school. And not young people, boys and girls standing up, some old men and old women standing in the passages, eager, desperately eager to hear the Word of God. There they stood in the Sabbath school. I was asked to give a 15-minute mission talk, which I did with Nadia Parase translating for me. And then again at 11 o'clock, I took the service. As we were meeting in the anteroom, Pastor Parase just said, now remember, Pastor, to my knowledge, there are 3 paid informers attending the church service today. I said, that doesn't really bother me. In Tanzania, we got used to that 7 years ago. But his counsel was, preach the gospel. which of course I had learned is the only thing we as ministers are allowed to preach. It didn't really bother me, though, to have those 3 paid informers. But as we went through that church service, those same dear old ladies and old gentlemen, I can remember a couple standing about halfway down the passage on my right. Right up here in front were 2 other old ladies that had been standing there from the time we had come into church that morning for Sabbath school. Those same dear old ladies were standing. The same old couple back there from 9:30 until after 12 o'clock noon, standing in that same place. Had they given it up, they wouldn't have gotten a place at all. So eagerly devouring the message. It made me feel so embarrassed. Some of them had come by taxi. Pastor Palace said they had come for as far as 55 kilometers to come to church and then to stand all morning. Pastor Palace had told us in Vienna, I will try and get permission to have you come with us for lunch on Sabbath to our apartment. He told us Sabbath morning before we walked into Sabbath school, with Nadia standing by his side, I'm very sorry, permission was not given for you to come to our apartment. But the Dorcas ladies and my wife have prepared a lunch for you, which we will have in a little room in the back of the church. I forgot an interesting point. As we came in for Sabbath school, those dear Russian brothers and sisters were so cordial between themselves. For any visitor, to us as visitors, the old men would come, many of them with grizzly beards, put their arms around you and give you the Christian kiss. Only men to men, only women to women. Never the twain should meet. Very strict, but so cordial. My wife says she's never been embraced as tightly, to her embarrassment many times, as she was there at Kiev. Those dear ladies just gave her bear hugs that almost stopped her breathing, she said. And the men likewise, so cordial. All of them would plank a big smacking kiss on your cheek and just let you know that you were welcome. It was a thrill. Well, the lunch. After the service, the announcement was made that Pastor Robinson would take another service at 2:30. They all scattered, separated, went out underneath the trees. They had planned on coming for the day. They had their little lunches, and we were taken in behind in this little room. Very crude, but it's not the furniture that makes the welcome. It's the people, and how cordial these dear folks were. Of course, we were in the Ukraine. Any of you that have a recipe book on Russian or Ukrainian, you know one of the main dishes, borscht, a soup, a vegetable soup. They served this borscht. It was a meal in itself, a huge plate, bigger than a serving plate, with all sorts of vegetables, and then in the middle of this big platter of soup, a lovely big dumpling. That's the borscht. But that was just the beginning of tribulation. My, the meal, the courses that kept coming on, we finally petered out so that all we could do was sampling those delicious things that these dear ladies had prepared for this special occasion. And then when we finished that, then there were at least 5 or 6 different desserts, plus fruit, ice-cold watermelon, I remember. Now, I commented on the ice cold. I turned to one of the pastors who could speak a little English. I said, do you always have this ice cold? No, he said, this is the first time I've had watermelon ice cold. A special favor, a special treat. In that room, around that table, were 22 of us. Of those 22, including the church elders, the head deacons, the deaconesses, the leader of the Dorcas, there were 6 ordained ministers from different parts. Pastor Palace had sent in and brought in the companies and the districts. Out of these 6 pastors, 4 of them had served prison sentences for preaching the gospel. And this one sitting beside me told me in broken English the reasons why he had been put in jail. He had this one had been in prison 3 times, and the offense for the last time was attending a prayer meeting with 5 other Adventists in the home of one of the brethren in his town. Well, I thought that the meeting would be over by 3:30, having begun at 2:30. But then when I finished, then they asked questions. So many questions, so anxious to hear what was happening, how the Lord's work was progressing in the part of Africa where I'd been serving. The questions went on until 5 o'clock. And at 6:30, we were due back in our camp. Then at 5 o'clock, the pastor came to me and he said, "We're having a wedding tonight. 2 of our young people are getting married, and they have requested especially that you say something at their wedding. We think we can get permission to prolong your stay out of your camp." Well, I said, "I'd be delighted. Do you think we can get permission?" Yes, he said, "I'll try and find a taxi." Now listen to this. A congregation of 700, not one of those families or individuals owned a personal car. They all came to church by taxi, by bus, by tram, by train. So he said, "I think we can find a relative of one of our church members," who presented himself in about a minute. "His cousin runs a taxi service, and we think we can find him and have him take you over. We'll go over there. This young man and I will go with you, and we will try and intercede for you to the authorities over there at the camp so that you can come and have a few hours with us this evening." Kiev is a large city. The camp was 35 kilometers from the church, right across the far side to the west of the town. The church was to the east. We finally found the taxi, drove over there. We finally found the head of the camp. He was very doubtful as to whether time could be extended. They requested him, please call. Make the necessary telephone call. Well, 2 or 3 telephones weren't working. Finally, we went into a room right at the back where he found a telephone that was working. He called the chief of police of Kiev. He let the pastor talk to him on the telephone. Finally, the pastor, quoting the name of the man that had given me, the high government official that had given written permission for me to be in that church that day, finally the chief of police said, "Yes, we can extend your visit." He said, "Let me speak to the director of the camp." The director of the camp was given instructions. He turned to me in very broken English. "How many hours you want?" I said, "Till 12 o'clock tonight, please." He put on my pass, 12 o'clock. We went back to the church. It was a very simple wedding, but a very interesting one. Very simple. I spoke for about 10 minutes, Nadia Parase translating, and I was the last one to speak. I was told that as soon as I finished speaking, I would be the first one to congratulate the bride and the groom. Well, poor, stupid, blundering, foolish American. I do what we do in our country. I kiss the bride. You know, that just about brought down the roof of that old shack of a church. At first they were shocked, and then they were surprised, and they broke out laughing. And I turned to the pastor. I said, "What have I done? Don't you do that in this country?" "Oh, no, pastor. You must never kiss the bride." Well, the milk had been spilled. But they understood. Their loving nature, they forgave. But I surely blundered into that one. I should have asked beforehand, but it all came on. We came back late from the other side of town, from getting the extension until midnight. Well, the party went on. The wedding was just a short one, not more than 20 minutes. Very simple. Then the congratulations took quite a while. Then the giving of the gifts, simple little gifts that were given. So by 11 o'clock, we left the church, having arrived there that morning at about 9. It was a full day. But you know, dear friends, it made me appreciate what a contrast. Do we appreciate the liberty that we enjoy? We left Kiev. We drove on down to Odessa, a very interesting city on the shores of the Black Sea, right down in the south. A real tourist attraction. They come from the far north of the Soviet Union to the balmy weather, Mediterranean climate that they have on the Black Sea. That was one of the resorts that really resembled some of these Western countries. And I'm surprised that there were some of the luxuries that we saw there. Some of these terrible capitalistic tendencies of enjoying oneself. There were a few of them at Odessa. It was really interesting to see. Driving down from Kiev to Odessa, it was also interesting to see that these Russian women, who are not allowed to do any private selling, trading, lots of apples in the Ukraine, beautiful apples, still not as good as these I've enjoyed here while I've been here at Helderberg. A different variety of apple, but all of the apples belong to the government. Only those that have been stung and that have fallen down to the bottom of the tree, those the women are allowed to gather. Sometimes half of the apple will be cut out, the worm and all of his nest and all of the rotten part will be cut out, and they sit beside the road selling half apples. And many apples so full of worms that you feel you've really wasted your ruble on them. That we stopped 2 or 3 times to pick up apples, driving through the countryside. The homes are so monotonous. Everything just the same. Only 3 variety of houses. Village after village, town after town. As you drive through, there are the houses with 2 windows in front, there are the houses with 3 windows in front, and there are the houses with 4 windows in front. Only the 3 variety of houses. When we got down into the southern Ukraine, down near Odessa, only then did we see a break in the monotony. From the far north up in Leningrad, right across that section of the Soviet Union, all the houses, 2 window for a young man and his wife, 3 window for a small family, 4 window for a large family. Well, as we went out of the Soviet Union, of course I had to present my little card and my Bible. We then went into Romania. We had an experience in Romania. Perhaps I could take 5 minutes to tell. Crossing over, right on the border, going into Romania, was a little town, a hotel of which we had made a reservation to stay in. A comfortable hotel. Things in Romania were much more comfortable than in the Soviet Union. But the next morning, as we went into the dining room of this hotel, a very comfortable hotel, to sit down for our breakfast, we could not communicate with any of those waitresses that were serving us. We just could not communicate. Finally, we gave up. We didn't know what to do. At that point, a young lady walked in, girl of 19, small, very attractive young girl. She walked in, started to sit down at a table nearby, looked over, saw the predicament we were in, came over and addressed us in perfect English. What a pleasant surprise. Through her, we were able to get a very nice breakfast. Then she talked to us for just 2 or 3 minutes, explaining that she was an official guide and that she would be glad to help us in Romania. She had just brought up a group from Bucharest, of Russian tourists visiting Romania, and she'd be glad to be our guide. And just then, two young men walked into the other side of the dining room. We noticed how cold our little girl became. Her name was Daniela, who had been so friendly, so cordial. As soon as she saw these two men walking in, she excused herself, went over to her table, and didn't make another squeak during that meal. We finished a good meal. As we walked by, I just casually said, "Thank you very much, Daniela, for your kind help." She didn't even reply. We went down to the rooms, packed up the suitcases, and as we were walking out, carrying the suitcases out to the car, our room was in rather a secluded portion of a passage. I heard some little steps pitter-pattering, came up to me. Here was Daniela. "Oh, Mr. Robinson, is it?" She'd look around. She wouldn't finish a sentence. Finally, she got it out. Is there any chance that you have room in your car to take me back to Bucharest?" I said, "We'd be delighted to, Daniela." "Well, I'm not supposed to. Those two men you saw up there, they're watching me. But I must get out of here. I must leave. Please meet me 2 blocks down the street, 2 blocks out that way, you'll find a service station. Beside the service station is a little grocery store. Please meet me there." We went down 2 blocks, turned over about 2 blocks, found the service station. By the time we got to the little grocery store, Daniela was there with her one little briefcase. She walked right past us as if she had never seen us. Went down to the corner of the street, looked around casually, came back. As she approached us, I opened the door. She slipped in, we closed the door and drove off. I was even becoming nervous. Was this a trap? What was she up to? Anything could happen in those countries. But as we got out of town, down those country roads, that dear young girl really opened up. She said, "You are the first American family that I have ever met. It's so good to be with you." She said, "You know those 2 men? I had to tell them that I was going down to the railroad station, that I had an urgent appointment back in Bucharest. I was going to catch the train." She said, I just hope they didn't follow me down. I just hope they weren't following me. I couldn't see them, but they were watching me. We official guides, almost every step we take is watched. But she says, "I'm in trouble. I must get back to Bucharest. I'm so glad that you're willing to take me." She did this to us when she found out that we were churchmen, clergymen, missionaries. She was so interested. She kept asking questions. She kept talking. There wasn't a dull moment during those nearly 5 hours that we were together. Then she said, "When you get to Bucharest, would you like a typical Romanian meal?" She says, "I know the director, the manager of one of the best restaurants in Bucharest. He's a good friend of mine. It's a very nice restaurant. 2 months ago, when Mr. Edward Kennedy was in Bucharest, I arranged to take him to a certain table. Will you allow me to arrange and let me take you to that table, a very distinguished table in this outstanding restaurant in Bucharest?" Well, then that afternoon, she took us over to the amusement park. Let the boys enjoy themselves for a little while. Showed us around. Here last month when we heard about that terrible earthquake in Bucharest, I just wondered what happened to our little friend Daniela. Before we left, we had the privilege of praying with that girl who had never heard a prayer before. The first time she had heard a prayer offered was when I prayed. She gave us her address. She begged us to write to her. She said she would answer if at all possible. She gave a roundabout address, not a direct address, a very roundabout address. My wife has written 4 times. We have never had a reply. We don't know what happened. But dear friends, let's daily thank the Lord for the religious liberty that you and I enjoy. And as we consider some of these other countries where such liberties are so foreign, we should be more grateful for all the Lord is doing for us.